The auditorium buzzed with celebration, families cheering, phones, raised banners waving. But at the back a man stood alone. Walt Harrison, a worn Marine jacket over old jeans, held a folded invitation in one hand. He stepped toward the front row, eyes searching. A woman in a headset blocked him. "This section's for family only." "I am family," he said quietly. "My son's graduating." She didn't check the list. "Step back or security will remove you." Two guards approached. The crowd didn't notice, but six men in the fifth row did. They watched the old Marine calmly return to the shadows, standing with quiet dignity. He didn't argue. He didn't need to, because men like him didn't speak loudly. They just stood until someone else stood up too. Walt Harrison had driven over 900 miles in his old rust-stained Ford F-150, a truck held together by more memories than metal. At 68, he didn't move with ease anymore. His knees ached in the morning, his hearing had long been half stolen by gunfire, and the world seemed to have shifted too fast around him. But none of that mattered today. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for his boy. Walt was a Vietnam veteran, a former recon scout sniper, who'd served with distinction and disappeared into civilian life with even more silence than he had left the battlefield. Years ago, there were medals, commendations, headlines, but those had faded just like the ink on his discharge papers. What remained was one tattered Marine Corps jacket, patched at the elbow, faded at the seams. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was armor. The last thing he had left that reminded him he once stood for something larger than himself. He hadn't booked a hotel. He couldn't afford one. Instead, he'd slept upright in the truck the night before, parked just off the edge of the college campus, a folded invitation still tucked safely into his glove box. It was handwritten by his son Caleb, the first in their family to ever graduate college. The words on the card were simple, but they clung to Walt's chest like a second skin. "Dad, I want you in the front row." Walt had never been the type to show emotion. He was quiet, steady, the kind of man who carried everything without complaint. But the weight of those few words had nearly undone him. He hadn't seen Caleb in person in over a year. They talked by phone, sometimes short calls, never sentimental. Walt wasn't good with soft words, but he never missed a Sunday call. Never missed a chance to say in his way, "I'm proud of you." Now, standing in the campus parking lot as the sun began to rise, Walt brushed the wrinkles from his jeans, adjusted the collar on that old jacket, and took a deep breath. He wasn't a general or a speaker. He wasn't expecting applause. All he wanted was one seat near the front and a glimpse of his boy walking across that stage. That would be enough. It had to be. Walt arrived before the doors even opened. He wasn't the type to show up late, not to a ceremony like this, not when it involved his son. He parked in the back lot, double-checked that the invitation was still in the inside pocket of his military jacket, and walked slowly toward the building with the kind of quiet dignity that had long outlived ceremony. The campus auditorium loomed ahead, bustling with staff and guests. Families were already gathering in groups, some dressed like they were heading to a gala, shiny shoes pressed to suits, designer handbags swinging from polished wrists. Walt stood out immediately, not just because of the age in his shoulders or the creases in his brow, but because everything he wore bore the weight of a different world. His old Marine Corps jacket had been through more than most people in the crowd would ever understand. Faded olive, frayed threads at the cuffs, a small tear near the seam he had sewn himself. Underneath, a plain blue shirt and jeans, freshly washed but far from new. His boots were military issue, worn down at the heels. Inside chairs were labeled and roped off with satin cord clearly marked for Family of Honor students. That's where he was headed. That's where Caleb told him to sit. He moved quietly down the side aisle, invitation in hand, and approached the entrance to the reserve section. A young woman in a black dress and headset stood by the rope's clipboard, in one hand scanning guests without really seeing them. Walt offered a small nod and held up the folded note. "My son asked me to sit up front." She didn't even read it. One glance at his clothes, another at his weathered face. "This section is for immediate family of graduates with honors," she said flatly. "You'll need to find a seat in the back. I am his family. I'm his father. No badge, no pass." "I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to step aside." He didn't argue. He just stood there a moment, uncertain whether to push further. The woman turned and whispered something into her headset. Moments later, two uniformed campus security officers appeared near the aisle. They didn't rush, but they looked directly at Walt as they began walking toward him. No one said a word. No one in the nearby rows even looked in his direction. A few parents glanced, then quickly returned to their conversations. Some straightened their ties. Others looked down at their programs. To them, he was just a misplaced stranger, an old man in the wrong seat at the wrong time, wearing a story no one wanted to hear. As Walt stood near the aisle, eyes scanning for a familiar face, the voices around him dulled into background noise. The clapping, the laughter, the proud parents with iPhones and floral corsages, all of it blurred into a distant hum. In his mind, the auditorium faded, replaced by the thick, wet heat of the Vietnamese jungle. He was young again, 22. Mud on his face, sweat soaking through his camo. M16 gripped tight. The ambush came fast, gunfire cracking through the trees, men shouting, some not getting up. A fellow Marine went down beside him. Simmons, hit bad, couldn't walk. Walt didn't hesitate. He threw Simmons over his shoulder and ran weaving through brush and bullets, the weight of a full-grown man, pulling against every muscle in his body. They'd both made it out. Barely. For that, Walt earned one of 3 Bronze Stars. Another came after leading a counter-assault on a fortified position when his unit was outnumbered. The third was for something he never even spoke about and likely never would. 2 Purple Hearts, shrapnel still in his leg. Nightmares that came and went without warning. But ask him, and he'd just shrug and say, "I came home." That's what matters. But coming home wasn't the end of the war. It just looked different. There were no parades when Walt stepped off the bus, no welcome banners. He'd gone from being a scout sniper to working overnight shifts loading trucks at a warehouse. Later it was construction, a few years cleaning boilers in the school district. No one ever asked what he'd seen or where he'd been. Walt never talked about it anyway. That was how his generation dealt with pain. They carried it quietly. The medals stayed in a drawer, the uniforms folded away, and the world kept turning, barely looking back. He never expected praise. But sometimes walking into a room like this, seeing the way people glanced and looked away, the way a patched jacket drew more suspicion than honor, it stung more than a bullet ever had. Because the truth for so many veterans like Walt was simple. They survived one war only to come home to a country that no longer knew how to see them. Back in the present, the ceremony buzzed around Walt, families leaning over to take photos, faculty members straightening their robes, ushers guiding guests down the aisles like it was any other event. To most it was, but not to everyone. In row 6 toward the center of the auditorium sat a group of 6 men. They blended in on the surface, dark suits, conservative haircuts, calm expressions. No flashy insignias, no loud conversations. If anything, they looked like high-level executives or retired agents. But that was the point. They didn't want attention. What they did want was a clear view of the man by the side wall. They'd noticed him the moment he stepped in. His walk, his posture, the way he scanned the room not with anxiety but calculation. They recognized the old Marine jacket, not because of the patches or color, but because they had seen it or him before. Among them sat Commander Blake Rourke, a former Navy SEAL team leader turned consultant for high-level federal security. Rourke had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places no newspaper ever mentioned. He'd spent years studying operations and missions from wars past. Walt Harrison's name wasn't just familiar, it was legendary in certain circles. Rourke leaned slightly toward the man beside him and murmured, "That's Harrison. Walt Harrison, 3rd Recon, Vietnam." The others nodded slowly. They knew the stories. "He's the one who pulled Simmons and Carrillo out of that kill zone," said one. "Held off an ambush with 7 rounds left and a busted radio. He's the one who disappeared after 75, said another. No promotion tours, no book deals. Just vanished." They all turned their eyes to Walt again, watching as he stood calmly holding the note from his son, unaware or perhaps completely aware of the attention. To the average onlooker, he looked out of place. An old man in worn clothes standing too close to the VIP section. But to these men, he looked like what he truly was, a warrior who never needed to shout about it. They said nothing, made no move. But the quiet tension among them shifted. The atmosphere around row 6 changed from passive observation to alert awareness. Because if there was one thing they had learned in their own years of combat, it was this. When a man like Walt Harrison is disrespected in public, the silence around him doesn't last long. And sometimes, silence is the loudest signal of all. The murmurs were barely audible at first, just low whispers among the crowd like distant winds shifting through trees. But to Walt, they were unmistakable. He had learned long ago how to sense tension before it became action. He heard the clicking of polished shoes before he saw them. Two security officers, one younger, in stiffened posture, the other older with a badge clipped to his belt. They moved with quiet authority, trying not to make a scene. But Walt had seen it all before. The forced politeness, the firm hands meant to usher you out without a ripple. Sir, one of them began, voice professional but detached. We've had a few concerns. We just need to verify your name. Could you please step outside with us? Walt didn't flinch. He stood his ground, pulling the folded letter from his jacket pocket. His fingers, thick and scarred, unfolded the note with deliberate care. My son wrote this, he said, eyes steady, said he wanted me in the front row. His words, not mine. The guard barely glanced at it. I understand, sir, but this isn't an official ticket. We're going to need to ask you to move. Walt looked at them both calmly without anger. Then he tucked the letter back into his jacket. I'm not causing trouble, he said quietly. I came to see my boy walk that stage. That's all. The younger officer stepped forward, hand resting near his hip. I'm asking you again, sir. Then it happened, the screech of a chair leg dragging against the auditorium floor. Sharp, sudden. Everyone turned toward the sound. From row 6, one of the men in suits had risen, then another. Then all 6 stood in perfect unison. Not frantically, not theatrically, but with the same precision they once used to clear rooms in hostile territory. Each reached into an inside pocket and pulled out a small, unmistakable object, a golden trident pin. They held them chest-high, wordless. The auditorium quieted. Whispers faded. Eyes turned. One of the men, tall with a hawk-like presence, stepped into the aisle. He walked calmly toward the security guards and Walt stopping just beside them. He raised his voice, not loud but commanding. That man, he said, is the reason I'm alive. Silence followed, thick and heavy. No one moved. The guards froze. And for the first time since Walt arrived, the world seemed to stop and look not at his jacket or his boots or the lines in his face, but at who he truly was. For a long moment, no one knew what to say. The golden pins glinted softly under the auditorium lights held firmly in the hands of 6 men who now stood like statues in the aisle. Their presence didn't feel aggressive, it felt absolute. Like a wall had just formed between Walt Harrison and anyone who dared move against him. The security guards shifted uncomfortably. One opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The other lowered his hand from his belt and stepped back, uncertain now of where authority truly rested. Up at the podium, the dean, mid-speech and mid-pride, stuttered as he glanced down at the commotion. We are honored today by distinguished guests and... He squinted into the crowd, trying to grasp what was happening, but the polished speech in his hands suddenly felt thin. Then another voice cut through the room. Younger, clear, cracked slightly at the edge, but unwavering. That man, the voice said, is my father. Everyone turned. On stage, standing out from the rows of graduates in cap and gown, was David Harrison, 22 years old. Honor stole around his neck, diploma still waiting to be handed out. He had stepped away from the line of students, microphone in hand, face flushed with emotion. If he leaves, David said firmly, then I leave too. The words landed like a thunderclap. You could hear the silence. You could feel it. He walked slowly off the stage, down the steps, the eyes of every parent, professor, and student following his every move. When he reached his father, David didn't hesitate. He stood tall, straightened his shoulders like a soldier would, and raised his hand in a formal salute. The gesture was crisp, respectful, and deeply personal. Walt blinked. His mouth didn't move, but something in his chest shifted. He'd expected a seat in the back, a distant glimpse of his son crossing the stage. But not this. Not public respect. Not this kind of reverence. Behind them, the 6 seals silently fell into formation. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply stood behind Walt and David like an honor guard, a wall of memory and brotherhood. The audience sat still. No one clapped. Not yet. It was as if the room had suddenly realized it had nearly missed something sacred. A father, a son, a history that refused to be overlooked. And for the first time that day, every eye in the auditorium was exactly where it should have been. The silence hung in the air like fog, thick, heavy, unspoken. Then came the whispers. Who is he? Did he really serve? What did he do to make those men stand for him? In every row, guests leaned toward each other, trying to connect the pieces. Some recognized the seal trident. A few whispered names, fragments of stories they'd heard once years ago from fathers or uncles who'd worn uniforms. But most simply stared because something sacred was unfolding, and they knew better than to interrupt it. Near the front of the auditorium, seated among the faculty and dignitaries, an older man slowly stood. His frame was straight despite his years, and the ribbons across his chest marked decades of service. A retired general, quiet until now. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice or call attention to himself. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and nodded. Once, firmly, directly at Walt. It wasn't showmanship, it was respect. One warrior to another. That single gesture sent a ripple through the room. A woman near the aisle wiped at her eye. A father holding a program in his lap sat up a little straighter. A group of students near the back lowered their phones and simply watched. Then softly at first, someone began to clap. Not the polite kind, the stiff, obligatory applause common at these events. This was different. This was slower, heavier, like every beat carried weight. Another person joined, then another. Row by row, hands began to move. Not with excitement, but with reverence. Walt didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't bask in it. He simply stood beside his son, hands folded in front of him, the same way he had stood at funerals, deployments, and flag ceremonies decades before. The applause grew not louder but deeper. It filled the auditorium not with noise but with recognition. Recognition of something the room had nearly missed. Recognition of a man who had once bled for their right to be here and had been nearly cast aside as if he didn't belong. The same usher who had blocked him earlier now stood quietly to the side, head bowed, clipboard pressed tightly to her chest. She didn't look up. The crowd was no longer clapping for a graduate or a name in a program. They were clapping for a man who didn't need to speak to be heard, and Walt. He simply nodded once to the general in return, because among warriors, words are often the least important part. Walt didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He turned slightly to his son David, whose eyes were glassy but unwavering. The boy, now a man, had walked off the stage, risked his moment, and stood in front of a full auditorium just to honor him. That was something no medal could ever equal. Walt placed a steady hand on David's shoulder. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but in that moment it held more weight than anything spoken from the podium that day. I only came to see you walk that stage. David looked at him, jaw tightening with emotion. He gave a single nod, then turned gently, guiding his father down the aisle. The path that had been blocked moments earlier was now clear, not by words but by presence. Every step forward was followed by silence. Not awkward silence, but something sacred, respectful, as if the entire room had agreed to pause and let this moment unfold untouched. The same usher who had earlier dismissed him stood off to the side, now still holding her clipboard like a shield. She didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. She simply stepped back, eyes lowered. Walt walked past her without hesitation, not out of pride, not out of spite, just forward, because his son was leading him now. When they reached the front row, David gestured to the empty seat reserved for distinguished family guests. No one objected. No one dared. Walt eased down into the chair, his old joints stiff, the fabric of his worn jacket brushing against polished suits on either side. The people seated nearby, who had earlier pretended not to see him, now sat still, not because they were afraid, but because they were humbled. Behind them, the 6 SEALs stood in quiet formation, arms crossed or held at their sides. They didn't sit. They didn't speak. They simply remained like guardians, not just of a man, but of what he represented. There were no speeches, no apologies, and yet everything had changed. This wasn't about a reserved seat anymore. It wasn't about protocol or dress codes or who wore what. It was about presence, about a man who had shown up without fanfare, without demands, and whose very silence had spoken louder than any microphone. Walt didn't need front row recognition. He didn't need applause. All he wanted was to see his son graduate, and somehow in seeking nothing, he'd ended up with the one thing most people chase all their lives: respect. When the final name was called and the last cap tossed into the air, the crowd erupted. Cheers, hugs, and camera flashes filled the auditorium. But even amid the celebration, a certain reverent hush lingered in the front rows. Walt remained seated, his hands resting gently on his knees. He didn't rush to leave. He wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he didn't have to be anywhere else. He'd seen his son walk the stage. That was more than enough. But people began to approach, not with pity, not with curiosity, with something else, something more rare these days. A young mother leaned down and gently touched his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for raising him and for everything else." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. A teenage boy wearing his older brother's ROTC cap offered a handshake. "My granddad was in Nam too," he said. "He would have wanted to meet you." Even the usher, the same one who had dismissed him earlier, stood off to the side, watching, ashamed but silent. Walt didn't look her way. Not out of spite. He simply didn't feel the need to. Then came the SEALs. The 6 men who had stood for him without hesitation now gathered around him in a tight semicircle. They didn't swarm him, didn't smother the moment. They stood with their hands either behind their backs or at their sides like soldiers paying quiet tribute. The tallest among them stepped forward. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, round, metallic, etched with wear. He placed it in Walt's palm. It was a challenge coin darkened with age and engraved with the emblem of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, Walt's old unit. The back bore a short Latin phrase, "Semper Vigilans," always vigilant. Walt looked down at the coin for a long second, then curled his fingers around it slowly. "We don't salute many men anymore," the SEAL said, his voice low, steady. "But we stood because we remembered." The other men nodded in silent agreement. Walt didn't answer. His throat tightened too much for words. But he nodded once and then looked up at his son, who stood just behind the circle, watching everything unfold. The applause was long over. The ceremony had ended. But in that small circle between weathered hands and shared history, something far more important had just been passed down. Not just honor, not just respect, legacy. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time Walt made his way back to his truck. The sun hung lower in the sky, now casting long shadows across the rows of vehicles and folding chairs being packed away. His old Ford creaked as he climbed in. The seat was cracked, the springs worn down from decades of quiet miles. But it was familiar, his own little corner of the world. He didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there for a while, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other gently turning over the challenge coin, now warm from his grip. The edges were smooth, the etching still deep. 3rd Recon, Semper Vigilans. From the other pocket of his jacket, he pulled out the folded invitation, the same one he'd carried the whole way from home. His son's handwriting a little crooked, but clear. "Dad, I want you in the front row." He stared at the words like they were carved in stone, not just because of what they meant, but because of how close he'd come to missing the moment entirely. And not because he was late, not because he wasn't invited, but because the world didn't look at men like him the same anymore. Walt thought of how many others like him had stood in silence over the years, in lobbies and waiting rooms, in the backs of crowded halls, overlooked, not because they hadn't earned respect, but because they no longer looked the part, because their service had grown quiet with age, because the ribbons had faded and the jackets were patched and the voices were too tired to correct the assumptions. He wasn't angry. That wasn't his way. But he wondered how many others like him had been pushed aside, that no one stood up for outside laughter, and celebration continued in pockets, families taking photos, students holding flowers. Life moved on, but inside that truck, a legacy rested quietly in one man's lap, not just in medals or uniforms, but in the son who had stood when it mattered. Walt smiled faintly just once, because sometimes the greatest honor isn't being saluted. It's knowing that you raised someone brave enough to do the saluting when you no longer had the strength. Some fathers raise warriors. Others are warriors who raise sons strong enough to stand for them. There's something quietly powerful about a man who never asks for recognition, who simply shows up, does his part, and expects nothing in return. Walt Harrison was one of those men. And the truth is, America is full of them. Fathers, veterans, neighbors. Men and women who sacrificed in silence and walked back into a world that too often forgot how to say thank you. This story isn't just about a graduation. It's about what we choose to see and what we so often overlook. In today's world where appearance can outweigh substance and quiet dignity is mistaken for irrelevance, stories like Walt's remind us of something deeper, that real strength doesn't demand attention. It earns it. So here's the question. How many people like Walt have you seen in your life? The quiet janitor, the neighbor who never talks about the old days, the man standing alone at the back of the room wearing a jacket no one recognizes anymore. Maybe it's time we start looking again. Have you ever known someone like Walt? Someone who gave everything but never asked for a thing? Share their name in the comments. Tell us what they meant to you. And if this story moved you or made you think twice about who you might have passed by today, give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that honor those who stand in the shadows. Because sometimes the loudest respect is the kind you don't have to ask for. And next time you're at a ceremony or a bus stop or a quiet diner, look twice. That man sipping his coffee alone, he just might be the reason you still get to stand free.